Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Stunned silence. MASH did that better than almost anything else on television. For 11 seasons, it told the story of a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War. But really, it was telling the story of ordinary people trying to hold on to their humanity while the world around them fell apart. It became one of the most beloved series in American history, and its finale in 1983 remains one of the most watched television broadcasts of all time. But the MASH that ended in 1983 was not the same show that premiered in 1972. The cast changed again and again over the years, and each departure left a mark on the series and on the actors themselves. Some left because they felt trapped by their characters. Some left because the show had become something they no longer recognized. Some left because the work itself had quietly worn them down. In this video, we're going to look at the real stories behind those exits and what happened to the actors once the camera stopped rolling on their time at the 4077th. Before it was a television juggernaut, MASH began its life as a book. A former Army surgeon who had served in Korea wrote a semi-autobiographical novel under a pen name, drawing on his own experiences treating wounded soldiers just miles from the front lines. The book mixed dark humor with genuine horror, and that combination struck a chord with readers. Hollywood took notice, and a feature film adaptation arrived in the early 1970s. Directed with a loose, almost documentary-style approach, the movie was irreverent, chaotic, and unlike anything mainstream audiences had seen. It arrived at a moment when the country was deeply divided over an actual war being fought overseas. And even though the film was technically about Korea, everyone understood what it was really about. The movie was a hit, and it wasn't long before network executives wanted to bring the concept to television. The series adaptation debuted in the fall of 1972. It kept the wartime setting and the irreverent tone of the film, but slowed things down just enough to let the characters breathe. Rather than a string of loosely connected sketches, the show built ongoing relationships and let its cast grow and change over time. That decision turned out to be the secret to its longevity. Audiences didn't just laugh at the jokes. They came to genuinely care about the people delivering them. The first season struggled to find its footing in the ratings, and there was a real possibility the show could have been canceled before it ever found its audience. A scheduling change gave it a second chance, and once viewers found it, they never really let go. Over time, the show became known for pushing boundaries other sitcoms wouldn't touch, using real combat footage, giving its characters lasting consequences, and trading the usual laugh track for the ambient sound of camp itself. That willingness to take risks extended to how the show handled its cast. As the series matured, so did its writing, and not every actor was comfortable with the direction things were heading. Ask any longtime fan which single moment left the deepest scar, and there's a good chance they'll point to the finale of Season 3. Colonel Henry Blake, the amiable and often bumbling commanding officer of the 4077th, receives his discharge papers. The episode plays out as a celebration. There are hugs, tears of joy, and a warm send-off for a man finally going home to his family. Then, in the final scene, one of the younger officers walks into the operating room and delivers the news that Blake's plane went down over the sea, with no survivors. There is no music. There is no laugh track. Just silence, shock, and the sound of medical equipment. It remains one of the most talked-about moments in television history, and it was the first time a network sitcom had killed off a beloved main character without warning. The actor behind Colonel Blake was McLean Stevenson, and his exit from the show set the template for how dramatic a MASH departure could be. Stevenson had been part of the ensemble since the very beginning, and his performance earned him a Golden Globe and enormous affection from fans. But behind the scenes, he had grown restless. As the show's focus increasingly centered on Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce, who was also becoming more involved in writing and directing episodes, Stevenson felt his own role shrinking. He wanted to be the lead of his own show rather than a supporting piece of someone else's, and at the end of Season 3 told producers he wouldn't be returning. The writers could have handled his exit the way most sitcoms did at the time, quietly transferring the character elsewhere. Instead, they used it to remind viewers that this was still, underneath the comedy, a story about war, and that not everyone who serves comes home. The backlash was immediate. The network received an enormous volume of mail, much of it from viewers who felt blindsided and betrayed by the loss of a character they loved. For Stevenson personally, life after MASH didn't go the way he had hoped. He was given a new sitcom built around his own comic persona, but it was canceled after a single season. A second attempt at series stardom fared even worse and became something of a punchline in entertainment circles. In later interviews, Stevenson reflected candidly on the choice, acknowledging that leaving MASH had cost him something he never quite got back. He continued to work steadily in television for years afterward, but he never again found a role that resonated with audiences the way Henry Blake had. When he passed away in the mid-1990s, his former castmates spoke warmly of him, remembering both his talent and his generosity as a scene partner. In a strange way, his departure gave the show one of its most defining moments, even as it cost him a role that had made him a star. If Stevenson's departure was loud and unforgettable, Wayne Rogers' exit was almost the opposite. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, one half of the original comic duo that anchored the show's early seasons alongside Hawkeye. The two characters bantered, broke rules, and got into trouble together, and their chemistry was a huge part of what made the early years of the series work. But as the show evolved, the balance of screen time shifted. Alda's character increasingly became the emotional and moral center of the show, partly because Alda himself was taking on more creative responsibility behind the camera. Rogers had signed on believing MASH would remain a true ensemble piece with roughly equal focus on its core cast. Watching that balance tip away from his character left him frustrated, and he later spoke about feeling that Trapper had been reduced from a co-lead to little more than a supporting presence with nothing meaningful left to do. Unlike Stevenson, Rogers didn't make a public announcement or negotiate an exit storyline. He simply chose not to return after season 3, informing production so late that the writers had to scramble to explain his character's absence at the start of the next season. Adding to the unusual circumstances, Rogers had reportedly never signed a formal contract for the role, which meant the producers had little legal recourse when he walked away. There was no farewell episode, no goodbye scene, nothing to give fans closure. Trapper John was simply gone, and a new character, B.J. Honeycutt, arrived to fill the gap left behind. Rogers didn't disappear from show business, but he eventually built a second and arguably more lucrative career for himself as a financial investor and commentator, becoming a familiar face on business television in later decades. He remained on good terms with his former castmates, and Alda spoke fondly of him over the years, describing him as one of the sharpest people he ever worked alongside. When Rogers passed away in 2015, tributes in the cast reflected genuine affection rather than any lingering resentment. His exit may have lacked the drama of Stevenson's, but Trapper John's abrupt disappearance remains one of the more unusual footnotes in the show's history. Of all the actors who left MASH, Gary Burghoff's departure was perhaps the most personal. Burghoff played Corporal Radar OReilly, the wide-eyed company clerk whose almost supernatural intuition and childlike innocence made him one of the most beloved characters on the show. He was also the only actor to reprise his role from the original film, and on television, he shaped Radar into something far gentler and more vulnerable than his big-screen counterpart, a symbol of the innocence war slowly erodes. By the later seasons, though, the demands of the role had begun to take a real toll. Burghoff has spoken about struggling with anxiety during his years on the show, and the grueling production schedule made it difficult to be present for his family. He and his wife had a young daughter at the time, and he later expressed real regret about how much of her early years he missed while working long hours on set. There were also disputes over his contract, as he sought reduced screen time and more flexibility to manage his personal life. The producers made some accommodations, but ultimately it wasn't enough to keep him from deciding, in season 8, that it was time to leave. Unlike Wayne Rogers, Burghoff was given a proper farewell. His exit unfolded over a 2-part episode in which Radar returns from leave to find the camp struggling without him, tries once more to hold everything together, and ultimately realizes it's time to go home and take care of his family's farm. The episode ends quietly, with Radar walking away into the distance, leaving his teddy bear behind on Hawkeye's bunk. It remains one of the most tender goodbyes in the show's run. After MASH, Burghoff largely stepped back from the spotlight. A short-lived spin-off didn't take off, and he eventually turned his attention toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, even holding patents related to fishing equipment. He has described his decision to leave as being about both burnout and family. A chance to put his personal life back together after years of being consumed by the show. Today he lives a fairly private life, rarely giving interviews, though fans who do encounter him still remember him fondly as the heart of the 4077th. Major Frank Burns was, for the show's first 5 seasons, its resident punching bag, a rigid, self-righteous officer whose insecurities and secret affair with Major Houlihan made him an easy target for Hawkeye and Trapper's pranks. Larry Linville played the role with a kind of gleeful pettiness that made Burns instantly recognizable, but as the series matured and its other characters gained depth and nuance, Frank largely stayed exactly as he was. Linville, who had considerably more range as a performer than the role allowed him to show, eventually felt he had taken the character as far as it could go. Rather than being pushed out, he made the decision himself not to renew his contract after season 5, later explaining that he simply felt he'd exhausted what Frank Burns had to offer. His departure ended up reshaping the show in a meaningful way. Without a cartoonish villain to lean on for easy laughs, MASH was forced to find its comedy in irony, character, and the absurdity of the war itself rather than slapstick cruelty. Many longtime fans still consider the years following Linville's exit to be when the show reached its creative peak. Frank Burns was written out off-screen, given a promotion that conveniently removed him from the story without a dramatic send-off. Linville continued working steadily in television afterward, though he never landed another role with the same visibility. Still, his contribution to the show's identity in its early years and the creative space his departure opened up remain a significant part of the series' evolution. When the show needed a replacement for Frank Burns, it found something far more layered in Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers. Where Frank had been a cartoon, Winchester was a slow burn. Cultured, proud, occasionally insufferable, but never simply a villain. Over time, the show peeled back his arrogance to reveal a man just as shaken by war as everyone around him, only better at hiding it. Unlike so many of his castmates, Stiers didn't leave partway through the run. He stayed until the very end, in his final scene, quietly teaching a group of prisoners of war to play music. It is remembered as one of the most poignant moments in the entire series. When offered the chance to continue his character in the spin-off that followed, Stiers declined, feeling that Winchester's story had already reached its natural conclusion. After MASH, Stiers built a long and varied career, including extensive voice work for animated films. Years later, he spoke publicly about his sexuality, explaining that he had kept it private for much of his career out of concern that it could limit the roles he was offered, a very real fear for actors working in that era. He passed away in 2018, remembered by colleagues not only for his talent, but for the quiet dignity with which he lived. It's worth remembering that not every meaningful departure or every meaningful presence belonged to the men in the cast. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan for the entire 11-season run, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the pilot and finale. Her character began as something close to a punchline, defined largely by a nickname borrowed from the original film. Swit fought to give Margaret more depth with each passing season, and by the time the show ended, Houlihan had become a fully realized, respected officer rather than a source of easy jokes. In a series defined by turnover, her steady presence gave the show a kind of anchor that few of her castmates could claim. Looking back across all of these exits, a pattern starts to emerge. Almost none of them were about scandal or feuding in the way tabloids might suggest. They were about actors wrestling with the same questions any working artist eventually faces. Whether their characters still had room to grow, whether the demands of the job were compatible with the rest of their life, and whether staying somewhere comfortable was worth more than the uncertainty of moving on. What's remarkable is how the show absorbed each of these losses and kept finding new ways to tell its story. Every departure forced the writers to adapt, and more often than not, that forced evolution made the series richer rather than weaker. MASH endured for 11 seasons not because its cast never changed, but because its creative team understood that change, even painful change, could be turned into some of the most powerful storytelling television had ever produced. More than 40 years after it went off the air, MASH still stands as proof that a show about a war fought decades earlier could say something timeless about loss, friendship, and the strange resilience of people trying to laugh their way through the worst of circumstances. The actors who left, whether loudly or quietly, whether by